The calls. The last voice online. 7 rain had been falling over the city since dusk. Not in violent sheets, but in a slow, patient drizzle that made the old hospital windows look as if they were weeping. Street Mercy Hospital stood on the northern edge of the city, a tall gray building of stone and glass, half modernized and half forgotten. By day, it was full of footsteps, voices, metal carts, crying, children, tired nurses, and the sharp smell of antiseptic. But by night, after the visitors had gone and most of the lights had dimmed, the place seemed to become something else entirely. It became hollow. It became watchful. Eleanor Hayes had worked the night switchboard for almost 3 years, long enough to know every sound the hospital made after midnight. She knew the hum of the vending machines near the west corridor. She knew the old elevator that groaned before opening on the 3rd floor. She knew the radiator beside the records room that clicked like fingernails against glass whenever the weather turned cold. And she knew that some parts of Street Mercy should never make a sound at all. The basement was one of them. No staff went down there anymore. Not officially. Not since the fire 12 years ago, when the lower ward had been sealed off, and the hospital board had decided it was cheaper to build above the damage than to dig into the truth below it. Eleanor tried not to think about the basement. Most nights, she succeeded. She sat alone in the small communications office behind the emergency reception desk, wearing a black cardigan over her pale blue uniform. Her hair was tied loosely at the back of her neck, though several dark strands had slipped free and rested against her cheek. The glow of the monitor painted her face in a tired silver light. On the wall before her was the old switchboard panel, a thing the hospital should have replaced years ago. Rows of small lights blinked beside numbered internal lines. Line 1 was emergency intake. Line 2 was surgery. Line 3 was maternity. Line 4 was intensive care. Lines 5 and 6 belonged to administration and security. Line 7 was dead. It had been dead for 12 years. Everyone knew that. At 2:17 inches the morning it rang. Eleanor did not move at first. The sound was soft, almost polite. One small ring, then another, then another. She stared at the switchboard. The tiny red light beside line 7 blinked steadily in the dark. For several seconds, Eleanor could not understand what she was seeing. Her tired mind tried to make it ordinary. A wiring fault. A glitch. Maybe maintenance had reconnected something without telling anyone. But no one worked on line 7. No one even touched that part of the board. The ring continued. Eleanor slowly reached for the headset. "Street Mercy Hospital," she said, her voice professional but thin. "How may I direct your call?" There was no answer. Only breathing. Small breathing. A child's breathing. Eleanor sat straighter. "Hello, static," whispered through the receiver, low and wet like rain falling inside a wall. Then a girl's voice spoke. "Please." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the desk edge. The voice was quiet, fragile, and distant, as though the child were speaking from the far end of a long corridor. "Please open the door." Eleanor felt the blood leave her face. "What door?" she asked. There was a pause. Then the girl said, "It's getting hot." The line went dead. For a long moment, Eleanor remained completely still. The rain tapped softly against the glass behind her. Somewhere far down the corridor, an elevator bell chimed, though no one stepped out. She looked at the switchboard. Line 7 was dark again. Eleanor removed the headset and placed it carefully on the desk, as if sudden movement might make the call return. It had been a prank. It had to be. Some bored teenager. Some patient's child. Some nurse with a cruel sense of humor. But the voice had not sounded like a joke. It had sounded afraid. By morning, Eleanor had convinced herself it was nothing. She mentioned it to no one. Not to the day operator who came in, smelling of coffee and perfume. Not to security. Not to the gray-haired maintenance man who passed the office, whistling some old hymn beneath his breath. Because to explain the call, she would have to say the words out loud. Line 7 rang, and she did not want to hear herself say it. The next night she arrived 10 minutes early. She told herself it was because of the rain, because buses were unreliable in bad weather, because she liked a quiet start to her shift. But when she entered the communications office, her eyes went immediately to the switchboard. Line 7 was dark. She exhaled. For hours, nothing happened. Nurses called for patient transfers. A doctor misplaced his pager. Someone from maternity asked for extra blankets. At 140, a drunk man came into emergency with blood on his shirt and a broken smile, claiming he had fought a statue and won. Ordinary things. Living things. Then 217 came. The red light blinked. The phone rang. This time, Eleanor stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward and struck the wall. "No," she whispered. Ring, ring, ring. Her hand trembled as she put on the headset. Street Mercy Hospital. Static. Then the same girl. Ellie Eleanor stopped breathing. No one called her Ellie anymore. Not since childhood. Not since Lucy. Her little sister had been the only person who said it that way, stretching the name softly like it belonged to a song. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Who is this?" The girl did not answer. "Who is this?" Eleanor repeated louder now. A faint sound came through the line. Not static this time. Something else. A crackling sound. Fire. Then the child whispered, "You said you would come back." Eleanor ripped the headset off and threw it onto the desk. The call disconnected. She stood in the middle of the small office, one hand pressed against her mouth, trying not to be sick. For 12 years, Eleanor had worked very hard not to remember the fire clearly. Memory was merciful when it wanted to be. It blurred edges. It buried screams beneath years of silence. It softened the faces of the dead until they became photographs instead of wounds. But that voice had opened something. A door. And behind it was smoke. Behind it was heat. Behind it was Lucy. Lucy Hayes had been 9 years old when she died. Golden-haired, stubborn, always cold. Always carrying a little silver bracelet with a blue charm shaped like a bird. She had been admitted to Street Mercy for a fever that would not break. Nothing serious, the doctors said. Just observation. Just one night. Then the fire started below. Then the alarms failed. Then everything became confusion. Smoke, shouting, and red light. Eleanor had been 16 then. Too young to be useful. Too old to be forgiven. She remembered running through the corridor. She remembered screaming Lucy's name. She remembered someone pulling her back. Or had she run away first? No. She would not think about that. Not here. Not at night. On the third night, Eleanor did not want to go to work. She stood in her flat for nearly 20 minutes with her coat in her hands, listening to the rain gather in the gutters outside. Her flat was small, tidy, and joyless. There were no photographs on the walls, no plants, no bright colors. Only books, a narrow bed, a kettle, and heavy curtains she always kept closed. At 9:40, she left anyway. People like Eleanor did not simply stop going to work because ghosts had learned how to use By midnight, the hospital had settled into its familiar silence. At 1:30, the lights flickered in the east corridor. At 1:52, security called to say one of the basement motion sensors had malfunctioned again, though no one had been down there. Eleanor wrote it down with cold fingers. At 2:16, she stared at line 7. At 2:17, it rang. This time, she did not answer immediately. The sound filled the office. Ring, ring, ring. Each one seemed slower than the last. Finally, Eleanor lifted the headset. She did not speak. Neither did the girl. For a few seconds, there was only the soft crackle of fire and the distant sound of someone crying. Then the child said, "Why did you leave me there?" Eleanor closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "I didn't," she whispered. The line hissed. "I didn't leave you. You locked the door." Eleanor's eyes opened. The office seemed to tilt around her. "What did you say?" "You locked the door, Ellie." The voice was not angry. That was worse. It was sad. Small. Patient. I was still inside. Eleanor tore the headset away again, but this time the call did not end. The child's voice continued through the speaker on the desk, distorted and faint. "It's getting hot again." Then, the red light died. For the rest of the shift, Eleanor sat with every light in the office turned on. She did not drink her tea. She did not answer calls, unless they rang twice. Every shadow beyond the glass doors seemed to hold the shape of a child. At dawn, instead of going home, she went to the records department. The archive clerk was not pleased to see her. "Fire records?" he asked, frowning over his glasses. "Yes," Eleanor said. "From 12 years ago. The lower ward. Those files are restricted. I work communications. That doesn't mean you get access to dead files." Eleanor leaned closer. "My sister died in that fire." The clerk's expression changed. Not softened exactly, but shifted into something less official. He sighed. "Wait here." 20 minutes later, Eleanor sat alone in a reading room with a cardboard box in front of her. Inside were reports, photographs, witness statements, maintenance notes, and pages damaged by smoke. She read them with numb hands. Electrical fault in storage room B. Emergency doors failed. 4 fatalities. 9 injured. Internal communication failure. She turned page after page until one line stopped her heart. Lower ward isolation room B7 remained locked during evacuation. Eleanor read it once, then again, then a third time. Her vision blurred. Attached beneath the report was a handwritten note, yellowed with age. Operator on duty failed to respond to repeated internal calls from line 7. Eleanor could no longer hear the rain. She could no longer feel the chair beneath her. Line 7 had not been an outside call. It had come from inside the basement, from isolation room B7, from the room where Lucy died. That evening, Eleanor returned to work with the file hidden inside her bag. She told herself she wanted answers. She told herself she wanted proof. But beneath all that buried deep where honesty lived, she knew the truth. She wanted punishment. The night passed slowly, too slowly. Time seemed to rot around her. At 210, the hospital lights dimmed. At 214, the emergency elevator opened by itself. At 216, Eleanor put on the headset before the phone rang. The red light blinked. Line 7, she answered in a voice barely above breath. Lucy. For a moment there was nothing. Then the child's voice came through, clearer than ever. You still remember me. A pause. Then softly, don't you, Ellie? The office door behind Eleanor creaked open, and from the dark corridor outside came the smell of smoke. The basement. The last voice on line 7. The office door stood open behind Eleanor like a mouth. For several seconds, she did not turn around. She simply sat there with the headset pressed against one ear, listening to the silence on the line and smelling smoke where no smoke should have been. It came slowly, at first thin and bitter, curling through the room like a memory. Then it grew stronger. Burnt paint. Wet ash. Something electrical melting behind walls. Eleanor knew that smell. 12 years had not dulled it. Lucy, she whispered. The line crackled. Then very softly the child replied, come downstairs. The corridor beyond the office was dark. Not fully dark. Street Mercy was never fully dark. The emergency lamps always glowed along the baseboards, low and red, turning the polished floor into a river of old blood. But tonight, the hallway seemed longer than it should have been. The nurse's station at the far end looked distant and blurred as though Eleanor were seeing it through smoke. She removed the headset slowly. Not real, she said to herself. This is not real. But her voice sounded small. From somewhere below, a metal door groaned. Eleanor stepped into the corridor. The hospital around her was still alive, yet somehow absent. Somewhere on another floor, a heart monitor gave its steady electronic pulse. Faraway wheels rattled over tile. A nurse laughed softly at something unseen. But here in this stretch of hallway, there was only the smell of smoke and the red light. The elevator waited at the end of the corridor with its doors open. Its display read B1, basement. Eleanor stopped. The elevator should not have been there. Staff access to the basement had been disabled years ago. Security had sealed the lower level behind 2 locked doors and a coded gate. Everyone knew that. Everyone avoided talking about it. But the elevator doors remained open, patient, and inviting. Inside, the lights flickered. A small handprint appeared on the mirrored wall. Eleanor stumbled backward. It was not made of blood. Not exactly. It was darker. Soot mixed with something wet. The hand was child-sized, pressed flat against the glass from the inside. Then another appeared, and another. A trail of little black handprints bloomed across the mirror. The elevator bell chimed. Eleanor ran. She did not remember crossing the corridor. She did not remember reaching the office. She only knew that a moment later she was inside, with the door locked, both hands pressed over her mouth to keep herself from screaming. The phone rang. Not the desk phone. The old switchboard. Line 7 blinked red. Eleanor did not answer. It rang until morning. By the time the day shift arrived, the smell of smoke was gone. The elevator was on the ground floor. The corridor was clean. There were no handprints on the mirror. Everything was normal. That was the cruelest part. Street Mercy looked innocent in daylight. The windows shone pale gold beneath the weak morning sun. Nurses carried paper cups of coffee. Patients slept beneath white blankets. Doctors spoke in clipped, tired voices. Life continued with terrifying confidence as though the night had not happened at all. Eleanor went home, but she did not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lucy's small hand against the elevator mirror. She saw the red light. She heard the voice. "Come downstairs." By late afternoon, Eleanor was sitting on the floor of her flat with the fire report spread around her like evidence in a trial. There were names she did not remember. There were rooms she had forgotten. There were statements from nurses, firefighters, administrators. Most of them said the same thing in different ways. Confusion, smoke failed, doors failed, alarms failed, communication. Then she found a name circled in blue ink. Dr. Adrian Voss, chief physician on duty during the fire. Retired. Eleanor stared at the name until the letters seemed to move. She remembered him faintly. A tall man with silver hair, kind eyes, a voice that always sounded tired. He had spoken to her after the fire. She remembered his hand on her shoulder, or perhaps she had invented that. By dusk, Eleanor had found his address. By nightfall, she was standing outside a narrow townhouse on a quiet street where the old trees leaned over the pavement like mourners. Dr. Voss answered the door after the third knock. He was older now, thinner, his face carved with deep lines. But his eyes were the same gray, intelligent, and deeply sad. For a moment, he simply looked at Eleanor. Then he said, "I wondered when you would come." The word struck her harder than any question could have. "You know who I am." "Yes," he said. Eleanor Hayes. She swallowed. "My sister was Lucy." Dr. Voss closed his eyes briefly. "I know." He let her in. His house smelled of old books and cold tea. Rain tapped against the windows. In the sitting room, a fire burned low behind a black iron grate, but Eleanor could not bring herself to sit near it. "Doctor." Voss watched her notice the flames. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Eleanor held the folder against her chest. "I need to know what happened." The old doctor looked toward the window. "You were told what happened. I was told an electrical fault caused a fire. I was told the lower ward was evacuated. I was told Lucy died quickly." Dr. Voss did not answer. Eleanor felt something inside her collapse. "She didn't, did she?" The fire cracked softly. "No," he said. Eleanor gripped the folder so tightly the paper bent. Dr. Voss sat down slowly, as though his bones hurt. The fire began in storage room B. Smoke moved faster than anyone expected. The doors on the lower ward were old, heavy. Some locked automatically when the alarm system failed. Lucy was in isolation room B7. Yes. Why? She had developed a fever again. They moved her there for observation. It was meant to be temporary. Eleanor's voice broke. She called. Dr. Voss looked at her. She called line 7. His face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. Eleanor stepped closer. "You knew." He lowered his gaze. "We found the call logs later. She was alive. For some time." How long, the doctor did not speak. How long his voice came out, barely above a whisper. 43 minutes. Eleanor felt the room turn cold. 43 minutes. Lucy had been alone for 43 minutes. Behind a locked door. In the dark. In the heat. Calling for someone. Calling for her. Eleanor shook her head. "No." Dr. Voss stood, but she backed away from him. "No. I was 16. I was upstairs. I wasn't an operator. I couldn't have. You answered internal calls sometimes," he said gently. "You helped at reception when your mother was with Lucy. Everyone knew you. You liked feeling useful." Eleanor pressed her hands to her temples. "No." Memory rose inside her like smoke under a door. A younger Eleanor at the reception desk. The alarm screaming. People shouting. The switchboard flashing. A red light. Line 7. A child crying through static. "Ellie, please." Eleanor stumbled. Dr. Voss reached for her, but she pulled away. "I didn't know it was her." "No," he said. "I don't believe you did. I told someone. Perhaps. I tried to help. I believe you wanted to." But Eleanor was no longer hearing him. She was hearing herself 12 years younger, coughing in the smoke-filled hallway as someone screamed for the basement doors to be shut. She remembered hands pushing her toward the exit. She remembered heat behind her. She remembered seeing the lower stairwell door swinging open. And she remembered closing it. Not to trap anyone. Not to hurt Lucy. To stop the smoke. To stop the fire. To survive. Eleanor covered her mouth. I locked it. Dr. Voss said nothing. I locked the stairwell door. You were a child. She was a child. His eyes filled with something like grief. Yes. The room blurred. Eleanor left without saying goodbye. That night, she returned to street. Mercy, because there was nowhere else to go. Her flat felt too small to contain what she now knew. The city felt too loud. The rain felt accusing. At 11:00 p.m., she sat at the switchboard. At midnight, the first strange thing happened. A patient from the third floor called the desk and asked why there was a little girl standing outside his room. Eleanor froze. What little girl? She's wearing a hospital gown, the old man said sleepily. She keeps asking where her sister is. Eleanor sent a nurse. The corridor was empty. At 1248, security called. Did you send someone to the basement gate? No. Well, the camera just caught movement. Eleanor opened the basement feed. The screen showed the sealed stairwell door. For a moment, nothing moved. Then a small figure stepped into frame. Bare feet. White gown. Hair darkened with soot. Eleanor stopped breathing. The girl turned toward the camera. The feed cut to static. At 136, every phone in the communications office rang at once. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room as the sound rose around her, dozens of bells screaming together. Line 1, Line 2, Line 3, Line 4, Line 5, Line 6. And Line 7. Always Line 7. She grabbed the headset. Lucy, stop. The ringing died instantly. The silence that followed was worse. Then the switchboard speaker clicked on. Lucy's voice filled the room. Come downstairs, Ellie. Eleanor closed her eyes. No. You promised. I was scared. So was I. The words cut through her with impossible tenderness. Eleanor began to cry. I'm sorry. Static breathed through the room. Then Lucy whispered, Bring the key. The basement key was in the security office. Eleanor knew because every night she passed the locked cabinet where it hung behind glass, unused and almost ceremonial. By 210, she had it in her hand. By 214, she stood before the sealed stairwell. The hospital behind her felt impossibly far away. The red emergency light buzzed overhead. The key entered the lock with a soft metallic click. At 217, Line 7 rang from somewhere below. Not through the switchboard. Not through the office. From beneath the stairs. Eleanor opened the door. Cold air rose from the basement carrying ash rainwater and the faint smell of a child's burnt hair ribbon. Step by step she descended. At the bottom waited a corridor that should have been sealed behind brick and steel. But it was open. The walls were black with old smoke. The ceiling hung low. Water dripped steadily from broken pipes, each drop echoing like a clock. At the far end of the corridor was a door. B7. Eleanor walked toward it, as if moving through a dream. Halfway there, something crunched beneath her shoe. She looked down. A little silver bracelet lay in the ash. The bluebird charm was blackened, but still intact. Lucy's bracelet. Eleanor sank to her knees and picked it up with shaking hands. Then a telephone rang inside room B7, an old wall phone. Its bell was bright, cheerful, terribly alive. Eleanor stood. The door to B7 was slightly open. From inside, Lucy whispered, Come, stay with me. Behind Eleanor, the basement door slammed shut, and the lights went out. The door. The last voice online. 7 darkness swallowed the basement whole. For one terrible second, Eleanor heard nothing except her own breathing. Then came the sound of the telephone ringing inside room B7. Bright, cheerful, almost ordinary. Ring, ring, ring. The noise echoed through the burned corridor, like laughter in a cathedral. Eleanor stood frozen. Lucy's bracelet clutched tightly in her hand. The little bluebird charm pressed painfully into her palm as if trying to remind her that it had once belonged to someone warm and alive. The air down there was colder than winter. Not natural cold. Dead cold. The kind that seemed to seep beneath skin and settle directly into the bones. Another ring. The half-open door of B7 creaked slowly wider. Beyond it waited darkness, thick as smoke. Then Lucy spoke again. Please don't leave me alone this time. Eleanor felt something inside her finally break. Not fear. Fear had lived in her for 12 years already. This was something older. Guilt. She stepped forward. The corridor lights flickered weakly overhead as she approached the room. Black stains climbed the walls like old scars, and melted plastic hung from the ceiling in twisted strands. Every few steps, Eleanor caught flashes of another night layered over this one. The basement alive with fire alarms, smoke boiling through the halls. Nurses screaming names into radios that no longer worked. Memory and reality had begun to overlap. By the time Eleanor reached the doorway, tears were already running silently down her face. The room beyond looked impossibly untouched. That was the first thing she noticed. Everything outside B7 was burned and ruined, but inside the room stood a small hospital bed with clean white sheets. A wooden chair sat beside it. A stuffed rabbit rested against the pillow, and on the wall beside the bed hung an old telephone. Its receiver swung gently as it rang. Ring. Ring. Eleanor stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door behind her closed softly. Not slammed. Closed. Like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. The ringing stopped. Silence settled over the room. Then, Eleanor saw her. Lucy sat at the edge of the bed. At first, Eleanor could only stare. The girl looked almost exactly as she had 12 years ago. Small, pale, wrapped in a hospital gown too large for her thin frame. Her golden hair fell softly around her shoulders, though parts of it were darkened by soot. Her bare feet dangled above the floor. She looked neither alive nor dead, only sad. Lucy lifted her eyes slowly toward her sister. "You came back." Eleanor's mouth trembled. "Oh God." Lucy tilted her head slightly, studying her the way children do when trying to understand adults. "You're older now." Eleanor fell to her knees. For a moment, she could not speak. All the apologies she had carried for years suddenly felt too small, too weak, too late. "I tried," she whispered. Lucy said nothing. "I tried to get to you." The child lowered her eyes toward the floor. "But you didn't." The words were soft, not accusing. That somehow made them unbearable. Eleanor began to cry harder. The room around them shifted faintly. The clean white walls darkened. Smoke stains spread slowly across the ceiling like ink in water. The temperature rose. Lucy looked toward the door. They locked it. Eleanor followed her gaze. The door to B7 was no longer open. It had become the old basement door from 12 years ago, heavy steel, blackened by fire, its small wired glass window glowing orange from flames beyond. Memory had fully awakened now. Eleanor could hear alarms screaming somewhere outside the room. She could hear people running. She could hear herself. A younger Eleanor. Crying. Panicking. The sound came from the hallway beyond the steel door. Lucy slid off the bed. "She's outside," the child whispered. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No," but Lucy took her hand. It was freezing cold. And suddenly, the room vanished. Eleanor stood once more in the basement corridor 12 years earlier, not remembering it. Living it. The fire alarm screamed overhead. Smoke rolled through the hall in thick black waves. Red emergency lights flashed against the walls, turning everything into a nightmare of crimson and shadow. Young Eleanor stood near the stairwell entrance, wearing a volunteer badge around her neck, coughing violently as nurses rushed past her. "Get upstairs," someone shouted. Another voice yelled, "Close the lower doors! Contain the smoke!" Then came the sound Eleanor had spent 12 years trying to forget. Lucy screaming her name. "Ellie!" The cry echoed through the corridor. Eleanor watched her younger self freeze, watched panic flood that 16-year-old face. Young Eleanor turned toward the corridor leading to B7. Smoke poured from it like a living thing. Another explosion shook the basement. A nurse grabbed young Eleanor's arm. "You can't go down there. My sister's still inside." The nurse tried to hold her back as flames burst from a doorway farther down the hall. The sprinkler system failed overhead. The lights flickered violently. Then came the order. "Lock the stairwell." Young Eleanor looked at the heavy steel door, looked toward the burning corridor, looked toward survival, and chose. Eleanor watched herself close the door, watched trembling hands slide the lock into place, watched herself back away crying while Lucy screamed from somewhere beyond the smoke. The memory shattered. Eleanor collapsed onto the floor of B7, gasping for breath. Lucy still stood beside her. Only now the little girl looked burned. Not grotesquely, not monstrously, just damaged. Skin darkened by smoke, tears cutting pale lines through soot. "I waited for you," Lucy whispered. Eleanor sobbed openly now. "I know. It got so hot. I know. I was scared." Eleanor covered her face with both hands. "I know." For a long time, neither of them moved. The room around them groaned softly as if the entire hospital were breathing. Then Lucy asked the question Eleanor had feared all her life. "Why didn't you come back for me?" Eleanor lowered her shaking hands. "Because there was no lie left. No excuse. No version of the story where she had been brave enough. I was afraid," she whispered. Lucy's expression did not change. "I heard you calling me," Eleanor continued. "I heard you, Lucy, but I was afraid." The child stared at her quietly. "I thought if I opened the door," Eleanor's voice cracked. "I thought the fire would spread. I thought I would die too." Silence. Then Lucy asked softly, "So you left me there?" The words pierced straight through her. Eleanor broke completely. "Yes." The confession echoed through the room like a final prayer. "Yes, I left you there." The lights above them flickered out one by one. Darkness crept slowly across the walls. But Lucy did not disappear. She only looked at her sister with terrible sadness. Then, unexpectedly, she stepped closer. Small cold hands touched Eleanor's face. "I know," Lucy whispered. Eleanor looked up in confusion. The child's eyes filled with tears. "You were just a kid too." Something inside Eleanor collapsed under the weight of those words. All these years she had imagined hatred waiting for her in the dark. But Lucy was not angry. She had only been alone. The room began trembling violently. Somewhere deep in the hospital, alarms started screaming again. Real alarms. The walls of B7 blackened rapidly as flames spread across them like living shadows. Smoke filled the ceiling. The temperature climbed higher and higher. Lucy looked toward the burning hallway outside. "It's happening again." Eleanor grabbed her hand. "No." But the child smiled sadly. It already happened. The fire swallowed the corridor. The walls melted. The bed burned away into ash. Yet somehow, Lucy remained untouched inside the chaos. A distant voice echoed overhead through static-filled speakers, code red. "Basement fire. Evacuate immediately." The same announcement from 12 years ago. Time had folded in on itself completely. Lucy stepped backward into the flames. Eleanor lunged toward her. "No." But Lucy only smiled. The expression was heartbreakingly gentle. "You came back this time." Then the fire consumed her. Eleanor screamed. The basement vanished. Morning sunlight poured through the windows of Street Mercy Hospital. The building stood calm and silent beneath pale gray skies. No fire, no smoke, no alarms. Only ordinary morning. Nurses arrived carrying coffee cups. Patients slept peacefully. Doctors discussed charts at the front desk. At 7:12 a.m., security discovered the basement stairwell standing open. Inside they found no fire damage, no sign of intrusion, no child, no body, only a small silver bracelet lying on the floor outside room B7, and Eleanor Hayes' headset resting neatly beside the old wall telephone. Eleanor herself was gone. The hospital searched for days. Police questioned staff. Dr. Adrian Voss said very little. No one ever found Eleanor, but strange things continued after her disappearance. Night operators reported occasional calls from Line 7, always at 2:17 a.m. Most calls contained only static, sometimes breathing, and once, only once, a young operator swore she heard a woman's voice whisper through the receiver, "Please." A pause. Then softly, "Don't leave her alone this time."